The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of their small cottage, casting delicate shadows across the hardwood floor. Kate sat at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a cold cup of coffee that had long lost its warmth. She stared at the official envelope that had arrived 3 days ago, its contents having turned their world upside down. The words echoed in her mind like a cruel refrain. Due to unforeseen circumstances, your adoption application has been denied. William stood by the window, his shoulders rigid with tension as he watched their neighbors across the street loading their car for what looked like a family vacation. The sight of children's laughter drifting through the glass made his chest tighten with an ache that had become all too familiar. They had been trying for 7 years to have a family. 7 long years of hope, followed by crushing disappointment, of medical appointments that led nowhere, of adoption applications that seemed to disappear into bureaucratic black holes. The silence between them had grown heavy over the past few days. Neither knew what to say anymore. They had exhausted all the comforting words, all the reassurances that everything would work out. Kate's sister had called the night before, her voice filled with well-meaning but painful sympathy. "Maybe it's just not meant to be," she had whispered, not understanding how those words cut deeper than any knife ever could. Kate finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store yesterday." She paused, swallowing hard. "She asked when we were going to start our family. I couldn't tell her we've been trying all this time." Her voice cracked, and William turned from the window, his heart breaking at the sight of his wife's pain. He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. "Kate, we can't give up. We've come too far to give up now." But even as he spoke the words, he could hear the doubt in his own voice. How many times had they said the same thing? How many times had they picked themselves up only to be knocked down again? The house felt too quiet, too empty. The spare room upstairs had been painted a soft yellow 3 years ago, neutral enough for either a boy or a girl. Kate had spent weeks choosing the perfect shade, imagining the crib they would place beneath the window, the mobile that would hang above it. Now the room remained empty except for boxes of decorations they had collected over the years, each one a symbol of hope that felt increasingly fragile. William's job at the local hardware store barely covered their basic expenses, and Kate's part-time work at the library didn't leave much room for the expensive fertility treatments they couldn't afford. They had sold Kate's grandmother's ring to pay for the last round of tests, a decision that had left Kate feeling like she was trading away pieces of her past for an uncertain future. Their marriage, once filled with easy laughter and shared dreams, had become strained under the weight of their unfulfilled longing. They moved through their daily routines like actors playing parts, going through the motions of normal life while carrying the constant ache of what was missing. Friends had stopped mentioning their own pregnancies around them, creating an invisible barrier that made Kate feel even more isolated. The adoption agency had been their last real hope. They had filled out countless forms, attended workshops, submitted to home visits and background checks. Kate had practiced what she would say during the interview, how she would convince them that she and William would be perfect parents. But somehow, it hadn't been enough. The reasons given were vague and unsatisfying, leaving them with no clear path forward and no one to blame except cruel fate. That evening, as they sat together on the couch watching a movie neither was really paying attention to, William reached over and took Kate's hand. "Remember when we first moved in here?" he said softly. "You said this house was going to be filled with the sound of children's voices." Kate nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They had been so young then, so certain that love and determination would be enough. The phone rang, cutting through the heavy atmosphere. Kate looked at the caller ID and saw her mother's number. She let it go to voicemail, not ready to explain once again why they hadn't heard anything positive from the adoption agency. The well-meaning questions from family and friends had become another source of pain, each inquiry a reminder of their failure to achieve what seemed to come so naturally to everyone else. Later that night, as Kate lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she listened to William's uneven breathing and knew he wasn't sleeping either. They were both lost in their own private grief, unable to find a way to comfort each other when they were drowning in their own sorrow. She thought about the conversation they had avoided for weeks, the one about whether they should accept that parenthood might not be part of their story. The next morning brought another gray, overcast day that seemed to match their mood perfectly. William left for work with barely a word, and Kate found herself wandering through the house aimlessly. She opened the door to the yellow room and stood in the doorway, surrounded by the ghosts of dreams that felt increasingly impossible. The sight of the empty space where a crib should have been made her sink to the floor, finally allowing the tears she had been holding back to fall freely. She cried for the children they would never tuck into bed, for the scraped knees they would never kiss better, for the school plays they would never attend. She cried for the grandchildren her parents would never have, for the family photos that would always feel incomplete, for the love they had stored up with nowhere to direct it. The weight of it all seemed crushing, and for the first time, Kate wondered if they should stop fighting against fate and find a way to build a different kind of happiness. 3 weeks passed in a blur of forced normalcy and unspoken grief. Kate had returned to work at the library, finding some solace in the quiet routine of organizing books and helping patrons find what they were looking for. If only finding what they needed in life could be as simple as checking a card catalog. William threw himself into his job at the hardware store, staying late to reorganize inventory that didn't need organizing. Anything to avoid going home to the heavy silence that had settled over their house like fog. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the call came. Kate was in the middle of helping an elderly man find a book about woodworking when her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it, but something made her glance at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it seemed important. She excused herself and stepped into the back room. "Mrs. Peterson?" The voice on the other end was professional but warm. "This is Sarah Mills from Children's Services. I know this might come as a surprise, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention, and your name came up in our files as approved adoptive parents." Kate's heart stopped. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. Our application was denied 3 weeks ago." "That was through the private agency, Mrs. Peterson. This is a different situation entirely. We have a 12-year-old boy who needs emergency placement, and frankly, we're running out of options. His current foster family can no longer care for him due to a family emergency, and most of our families are either full or not equipped for a child his age." Kate gripped the phone tighter. 12 years old? They had always imagined starting with a baby, someone they could raise from the very beginning. "I know it's not what you originally requested, but Marcus is a special case. He's been in the system for 4 years, and honestly, he's had a rough time. He's incredibly bright but has trust issues, which is understandable given his history. He needs a stable family willing to be patient with him." Kate's mind raced. What happened to his parents? His mother passed away when he was 8. No father in the picture. He lived with his grandmother for a while, but she developed dementia and couldn't care for him anymore. He's been through several foster homes since then, and each placement has ended badly. Not because he's a bad kid, but because he's afraid to get attached only to be moved again. The librarian felt her chest tighten with emotion. A boy who had lost everyone, who was afraid to trust again. "Can I talk to my husband?" "Of course. But Mrs. Peterson, I need an answer by tomorrow morning. Marcus is currently staying at a group home, and it's not the right environment for him. He's scheduled to be moved to another temporary placement across the state if we can't find something local." Kate called William immediately. He was in the middle of helping a customer choose paint colors, but when he heard the urgency in her voice, He stepped outside. As she explained the situation, she could hear his breathing change over the phone. 12 years old, he repeated slowly. That's not exactly what we planned. I know, but William, what if this is meant to be? What if we've been thinking about this all wrong? We always said we just wanted to be parents, to give love to a child who needed it. William was quiet for a long moment. What's his name again? Marcus. And William, the social worker said he's had such a hard time. He's been through so much loss already. That evening, they sat at their kitchen table with a folder full of information about Marcus. His school photo showed a serious-looking boy with dark hair and eyes that seemed older than his 12 years. His grades were excellent in subjects he enjoyed, but he struggled with behavior issues when he felt overwhelmed or unsafe. The social worker had been honest about the challenges. Marcus had run away from 2 foster homes, not because he was mistreated, but because he became convinced that every placement was temporary. He had developed a pattern of pushing people away before they could abandon him. He was polite but distant, incredibly intelligent but reluctant to show it because previous foster families had found his questions and observations intimidating. Listen to this, Kate said, reading from his file. His 3rd-grade teacher wrote that he has an exceptional understanding of literature for his age and often stays after school to discuss books with her. But his 4th-grade teacher noted that he rarely speaks in class and seems to prefer being invisible. William studied the photo again. Something about the boy's expression reminded him of his own childhood, growing up with parents who worked constantly and left him to figure out most things on his own. He had learned early that relying on adults led to disappointment. The social worker mentioned that he loves building things, Kate continued. Apparently, he once constructed an entire model city out of cardboard boxes and bottle caps while staying at the group home. Maybe you could teach him about woodworking or help him with projects. They talked late into the night, weighing the pros and cons, discussing whether they were ready for the unique challenges of parenting a child who had already experienced so much trauma. It would be different from starting with a baby, but maybe different didn't mean wrong. The next morning, Kate called Sarah Mills with their answer. Yes, they wanted to meet Marcus. Yes, they were willing to try. The meeting was arranged for that afternoon at the social services office. Kate changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on a simple blue sweater that she hoped looked maternal, but not trying too hard. William wore his best jeans and a button-down shirt, the same outfit he had worn to church when they were still attending regularly, back before their faith had been tested by years of disappointment. Marcus was waiting in a small conference room when they arrived, sitting perfectly straight in his chair with his hands folded in his lap. He was smaller than Kate had expected, thin in a way that suggested he hadn't always had enough to eat. His clothes were clean, but clearly second-hand, and he carried a worn backpack that seemed to contain everything he owned in the world. Marcus, these are Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, Sarah said gently. They've been hoping to meet a young person like you who might want to be part of their family. The boy looked up at them with guarded eyes, studying their faces as if trying to determine what they wanted from him. Hello, he said politely, his voice barely above a whisper. Kate felt her heart break a little at the careful distance in his voice, the way he held himself as if ready to run at the first sign of trouble. This wasn't the meeting she had imagined all those years ago, but sitting across from this serious, scared child, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't about getting what they had originally wanted. This was about giving what was needed. William leaned forward slightly, not wanting to seem intimidating. Marcus, I heard you like building things. I work at a hardware store, and I've got a workshop in our garage. Maybe you'd like to see it sometime. For the first time, Marcus's expression changed slightly, a flicker of interest crossing his features before the careful mask slipped back into place. I don't want to break anything, he said quietly. Breaking things is part of learning. William replied. "I've broken plenty of things in that workshop, and each time I learned something new." Kate watched the interaction, seeing something pass between her husband and this wounded child. Maybe they weren't getting the family they had planned, but perhaps they were getting the family they were meant to have. Marcus had been living with them for 2 months, and while there had been progress, it felt fragile, like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. He was unfailingly polite, kept his room spotless, and never asked for anything beyond the basics. Kate often found herself wishing he would make a mess, leave his shoes in the hallway, or complain about dinner like a normal 12-year-old. The breakthrough came on a rainy Saturday afternoon in October. Kate was in the kitchen making soup when she heard raised voices from the garage. Through the window, she could see William and Marcus standing over what appeared to be the remains of a wooden birdhouse project. Marcus was backing away from the workbench, his face flushed with frustration and embarrassment. "I told you I would break something," Marcus said, his voice tight with held-back tears. "I always mess everything up. That's why nobody keeps me." Kate watched as William moved slowly toward the boy, not trying to corner him, but not letting him retreat completely either. "Marcus, look at me," William said firmly but gently. "Look at me, son." The word son hung in the air between them. It was the first time either Kate or William had used that word, and Kate saw Marcus freeze at the sound of it. "You didn't break anything that can't be fixed," William continued. "And even if you had completely destroyed it, that wouldn't change how we feel about you. You're not going anywhere, Marcus. Not because you made a mistake, not because you're frustrated, not for any reason." Kate saw Marcus's shoulders begin to shake, and suddenly all the careful control he had maintained for 2 months crumbled. The tears he had been holding back for who knows how long finally came, and William pulled him into a hug that the boy initially resisted before melting into it completely. That evening, after Marcus had gone to bed, Kate and William sat in their living room feeling emotionally drained but hopeful. It was the first real emotion Marcus had shown since arriving, the first crack in the wall he had built around himself. "He called me Dad when he said goodnight," William said quietly, still amazed by the moment. "Just once, and then he turned red like he'd said something wrong, but he said it." Kate smiled, remembering how Marcus had hesitated at her bedroom door earlier, wanting to say something but not knowing how. Finally, he had whispered a barely audible, "Thank you," before disappearing into his room. The next few weeks brought small miracles. Marcus began leaving books on the coffee table instead of immediately returning them to his room. He started asking questions about William's projects and even began suggesting improvements. Most importantly, he began to test boundaries in normal, healthy ways that showed he was starting to believe this placement might be permanent. The real test came in November when Marcus got into a fight at school. Kate's heart sank when the principal called, not because Marcus had been in trouble, but because she feared this might be the kind of incident that had disrupted his previous placements. When she arrived at the school, she found Marcus sitting in the office with a split lip and defiant eyes. "The other boy was making fun of Tommy Rodriguez because his mom packs him weird lunches," Marcus explained later as they drove home. "He called Tommy names because his family doesn't have much money. I told him to stop, and when he wouldn't, I made him stop." Kate glanced in the rearview mirror at Marcus, who was clearly braced for punishment, for disappointment, for the beginning of the end of this placement. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of the ice cream shop they passed every day. "What are we doing?" Marcus asked suspiciously. "Getting ice cream," Kate replied simply. "You stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. That's the kind of person I'm proud to call my son." Marcus stared at her in confusion. "But I got in trouble at school." "Yes, and there will be consequences for fighting, even when your reasons were good. But Marcus, defending someone who was being bullied shows character. Your heart was in the right place. And that matters more than following every rule perfectly. That night, as Kate tucked him into bed, Marcus looked up at her with eyes that were no longer quite so guarded. "Are you really going to keep me? Even when I mess up?" Kate sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing his dark hair away from his forehead. "Marcus, families don't give up on each other just because someone makes mistakes. We're going to mess up sometimes, all of us. That's what families do. But we also forgive each other and try again. What if I can't stop being scared that you'll change your minds? Then we'll help you feel safe day by day until you believe it's true." The holidays that year were different from any Kate and William had ever experienced. Marcus approached Christmas with the wariness of a child who had learned not to expect too much, but also with the tentative excitement of someone beginning to hope. They spent Christmas Eve putting together a complex Lego set that Marcus had mentioned wanting months earlier, and Kate watched William patiently help the boy work through frustrating sections. On Christmas morning, Marcus crept downstairs early and found Kate already in the kitchen making pancakes. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her move around the familiar space. "Mom," he said quietly, testing the word. Kate turned around, her eyes immediately filling with tears at the sound of the word she had waited so long to hear. "Yes, sweetheart? Are you happy? That it's me instead of a baby?" Kate set down the spatula and knelt to Marcus's eye level. "Marcus, I spent years thinking I knew exactly what our family was supposed to look like. But I was wrong. Our family looks like this, like you and me and Dad, and I couldn't be happier or more grateful." Later that morning, as they sat surrounded by wrapping paper and watched Marcus carefully examine each gift as if trying to memorize every detail, William reached over and squeezed Kate's hand. The family they had built looked nothing like what they had originally planned, but it was perfect in ways they never could have imagined. That afternoon, William found Marcus in the garage working on a project of his own. The boy had been secretly building a small wooden box, carefully sanding each piece and fitting them together with precision that surprised his father. "What's that for?" William asked. Marcus looked up, slightly embarrassed but proud. "It's for Mom, for her jewelry. I noticed she keeps her rings and things in that old dish on her dresser, and I thought maybe she'd like something nicer." William felt his chest tighten with emotion. This child, who had been through so much loss and disappointment, was thinking of ways to give back to the people who had welcomed him home. 6 months later, on a warm spring evening, Kate found herself standing in the doorway of what was no longer the yellow room, but Marcus's room, decorated with his drawings, his books, and his ongoing projects. He was at his desk working on homework, his tongue sticking out slightly in concentration the way it always did when he was thinking hard. "Marcus, dinner's ready," she called softly. "Coming, Mom," he replied without looking up, and Kate marveled at how natural the word sounded now, how it had become as much a part of their daily vocabulary as breathing. As they sat around the dinner table that night, Marcus chattering about his day at school and his latest project idea, Kate caught William's eye across the table. They had spent so many years fighting their tears over what they couldn't have. Now, as she looked at their son, animated and happy and completely belonging to them, she realized that sometimes the door you're afraid to open leads to exactly where you're supposed to be. The family they had received wasn't the one they had ordered, but it was the one that had been waiting for them all along. Marcus had needed them, but they had needed him just as much. In learning to heal his heart, they had discovered that their own hearts had been healed as well.